In the past week or so, there were two big events in the world of women's health. First was the all-male House contraception hearing about whether religious institutions can opt out of paying for birth control. And the other was a proposed Virginia law that would require women to get ultrasounds before they were allowed to have abortions. There's a huge outcry from women about these two events. And David, what do you make of these past couple weeks in the women's health wars? Do you think that these are kind of just fringe moves that will be defeated and they're like all the other fringe moves that we've seen in the past decades? Or do you think we're moving into some kind of new stage?
I think it's pretty clear that as a cultural issue, we're not going back to an era where women can't get contraception or where there's stigmatization of women who use contraception. That part is obvious. On the particulars of the federal mandate for contraceptive coverage and free contraception for women, I'm not sure that the Obama administration has got the great victory that it hoped it was going to get. I think it had a fantasy that it had jujitsu'd the Republicans and conservatives, but now all these religious organizations that self-insure are saying, you know what, we still are going to have to be forced to pay for contraception that we don't want to pay or infringing on our religious liberty. What all of it on this federal contraception points out is how incredibly stupid it is to have a healthcare system which is based only on employers supplying healthcare to employees. That why should I, as an employee of the Catholic Church or a synagogue or whoever, whatever it is, why should my choice about my reproductive health be determined by who my employer is? It should be based on some general set of healthcare principles, and people either should buy insurance as individuals out in the marketplace, or there should be some kind of grand national healthcare that's supplied by the federal government. The idea that it's employers that one by one are making healthcare decisions is just demented. And so I think that's the larger context for the stupidity around this federal contraceptive regulation.
Right, but I don't think it's going to have the result of bringing single payer back on the table or moving. I mean, I don't think anyone's going to end up being happy going forward. I mean, this is what we have, right?
Sure. As a policy matter, you're absolutely right. I think that
right.
The issue is that this kind of social issue, and I guess this is the tenor of your question to begin with, these social issues are very useful for certain groups to get exercised about. That religious organizations, and particularly conservative religious organizations, can get really, really worked up about this law and about them being forced to supply contraception against their religious principles to people, and that is a great fundraising tool for certain groups and a great political tool for certain kinds of candidates. And then on the other side, the things like the idiotic Virginia vaginal ultrasound law are great for women's groups to fundraise for and for people who want to organize women on the left to get outraged.
But you think it'll just be the continued Sturm and Drang from both sides that has been going on for a long time, and it's not going to move the needle necessarily either way.
You know what does seem new to me is Rick Santorum. Like what Rick Santorum is saying about contraception on a national stage as a presidential candidate who's suddenly being taken extremely seriously, that is new. Like the actual doctrine behind what he's saying is very, very old, but the fact that a mainstream candidate is saying something that extreme about contraception, that's new. And I think that's moving the needle, maybe not necessarily in a policy sense, but in a sort of to what extremes people are taking it.
Right. But I think for many voters, it's not a huge issue. I mean, I guess it's the fundamental question for me. I find it difficult to parse whether or not, again, that this is my original question. Like, is it a new frontier, or is it just like we're going to go back and forth as we've gone back and forth? Because I asked, someone I know who isn't a liberal Democrat, whose Facebook feed isn't filled with people.
Where did you meet this person?
I know, it's so confusing, but they, all the commentary from liberal feminists is like, oh, Republicans are just doing this to take away contraception, and it's not about religious freedom. But Republicans really do think that this is about religious freedom, and so it's not.
Well, there's something to that point,
right?
And David, I want to go back to your original point where you said that you don't think Obama pulled off this jujitsu where he managed through sort of this lawyerly distinction to keep religious freedom, unviolated and to make reproductive rights champions happy. Why you think just the pushbacks in the congressional hearings this week, or what?
So the solution that President Obama came up with was the solution whereby religious organizations would not actually have to supply the contraceptive coverage to their employees, that it would be the insurer would do it separately. But it turns out, of course, that a lot of these large religious organizations self-insure. Mm-hmm. And therefore, there is no separate system for them to supply it. And so the solution is not a solution for them if they really believe that this violates their principles. They are now in the same position they were with the original rule. So President Obama's solution was no solution at all for them.
So then where is there to go?
Back to non-employer-based health insurance.
Yes.
Right, but we're not going to go there. So what there is there's the time for lots of theatrics. Your point about Santorum is really interesting, Noreen, because watching him in action is absolutely fascinating to see his culture warrior stuff, things that you thought were litigated in some cases 50 years ago, in other cases 25 years ago or 10 years ago, certainly things that you were certain had been already litigated and settled in the public mind. For him to be going out and actually campaigning on them is enthralling. It's like a time machine. Do
you think it's because he walks the walk that he is able to make these points so strongly in the mainstream that haven't been able to be made? You know, he has the 7 kids and
so does Nancy Pelosi. That's what's weird for me as a Catholic watching this play out. Like he scans as an evangelical, you know, and Catholics tend to be really private people, to make a broad cultural generalization. And he is the opposite of that.
But Noreen, you're like an old school Catholic. There's a whole group of new school Catholics, and Newt Gingrich fits in there, and all these people who are these Catholic converts, and Clarence Thomas is another one, which is a kind of Catholicism, which is almost evangelical Catholicism. It's very traditional Vatican,
but it's a minority.
It's a minority
group within Catholicism,
but it's a growing minority,
and it's very highly representative in the conservative elite, though. There's a lot of extremely traditional Catholics in the Washington conservative elite.
Agreed. It is just weird for me to watch that be the version of Catholicism that is brought into politics now, when for many years it was sort of in the Kennedy mold. That is no longer what's being played out. I mean, on the left, sure, but that's not what's getting the attention. This has been widely cited, but if you look at the stats on contraception, most Catholics, 98% of Catholic women use contraception. So he, again, I think is in the minority.
One interesting theory about this, which I'm interested in your guys' views about, is that right now the economy is seems relatively better than it seemed.
Right.
And in particular, Mitt Romney's campaign, which has been based on an economic case against President Obama, that economic case is not as strong as it was, say, a month or 2 months ago. All this Detroit is back. The jobs picture is slightly better than it's been. And you have a group of extremely angry conservative voters whose major intellectual objection to President Obama, that he's ruined the economy, does not perhaps feel as strong as it did to them a few months ago. And so where are they turning? They're turning to some other way in which President Obama is betraying the nation. And he's betraying the nation with his socialist, anti-religious, sexually promiscuous values that he's trying to shove down the throat of America's religious people. The failure of the economic argument at this current moment has led to the success of Santorum and the success of these socially conservative arguments.
I think that's a really smart point. I think that goes farther to explaining why Santorum, is surging at exactly the right moment than anything else I've heard. I buy it.
I think I have a warped perception because in the news that I follow, this stuff is huge news every time there's any burp about contraception or abortion. It seems like the outrage world rears its head, and so it seems like it's a huge deal. I feel like some of this was burbling up in the fall before the economy seemed to be improving so dramatically, but I think it's still a totally valid point.
Another one of Santorum's really interesting arguments is this point about prenatal testing, that prenatal testing is used as a form of eugenics, as a way to get rid of disabled kids. That parents see that their kids have Down syndrome or trisomy 18 or whatever it is, and then they get abortions because they've had these prenatal tests, whereas historically these children might just have been born and would have been raised.
I think it's a really smart pro-life strategy to force pro-choice people to talk about it. And Rick Santorum would be wise to continue to move forward talking about this, because basically women who choose to abort, when they're faced with this, my sense is they're not doing it for eugenics purposes, but they're doing it because they don't want to face the hardship of raising a special needs child. And they, if pressed, they would be forced to admit that.
But that's what they're defining as eugenics. Like, if you're going to hop inside his argument for a minute, that's what he's calling eugenics.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I know. And they will have to defend that because that's what it is and that's what's happening.
Right.
So
exactly.
The idea that it should be a private choice and it shouldn't be something that's legislated, it's really hard for them to win points saying that. You know, once it's moved back into this personal thing, like you are killing Down syndrome babies, pro-choicers have completely lost the fight. So it's actually a really wise thing for him to hone in on.
This is slightly off topic, but the Huffington Post just published something, and I hadn't heard this before. In 1995, Santorum gave an interview in which she said, I was pro-choice basically until I entered politics, which I found fascinating, that is out there. Like, it was in Philadelphia Magazine, I think. And that was before he had, before he had as many children as he had his special needs child. But I just thought that was really sort of...
His wife lived with an abortion provider, which is something we've mentioned on the Gabfest before. Will Salatin's great series on Mitt Romney's views on abortion and how they've changed or not changed over the course of his career is really instructive. But as someone like Santorum, who's so deeply pro-life, it baffles me that he could once have been pro-choice or his wife could have once been pro-choice.
And this HuffPo article quoted the guy that she lived with, the abortion provider. Who knows if this is true, but supposedly Santorum's wife, Karen, said to this guy, oh, I just met this guy, you'll like him. You know, he's very involved in politics, he's pro-choice. So who knows? But Rick Santorum is fascinating.
Just one other small point on this. I've always wanted to write a story about this, and I've never actually seen a really great one written. But the way in which disabled kids have become a conservative touchstone, that there's a lot of leading conservatives who have disabled kids, the way children with disabilities and taking responsibility for them and raising them has become part of the conservative story is totally enthralling to me. It's a very powerful argument. I mean, I do think that Sarah Palin, the fact that she has this child with Down syndrome is really interesting. Doesn't Michelle Bachmann, am I wrong about that? Thinking that she has a special needs kid?
No, I think she just has a lot of foster children.
And she adopted kids with, I don't know if they had Down syndrome, but some of them had problems of
and Santorum, and there's several other examples when I looked at this once of leading conservatives who have special needs kids and who are very emphatic about how important that is and how it reflects on pro-choice and pro-life issues.